Intro. Hi, it's Katrina. Number 10. The Vatican Necropolis. Hiding underneath what is arguably the most famous basilica in the world is a genuine city of the dead. This ghoulish necropolis is located directly underneath Vatican City's St. Peter's Basilica. Above ground is a world of wonder, a structure filled with beautiful artwork, fascinating frescoes, and hundreds of years of history. But 5 stories beneath it, hidden down in the darkness underground, is a ruin that dates back to the original founding of the Roman Empire. The altar at St. Peter's is at the apex of all of this history. The altar is stacked upon 2,000 years of bones, with the bodies of the dead hidden way underneath it. Many of the bodies buried underneath the basilica aren't even from Christians or Catholics. The oldest burial ground dates back to the 1st century AD and was used for pagans. Above that is yet another level of burials from the 5th century. This one is a bit more interesting because it's a mix of both pagans and Christians, a mausoleum from a time when the pagans of Europe were slowly converting to Catholicism. These 2 levels alone account for roughly 90% of the time the Roman Empire was in power, between the years 27 BC and 476 AD. Even though St. Peter's Basilica is what everyone knows and what the hill is famous for, it was a sacred place for a very long time. In another surprising twist, there is a hidden church buried underneath the floor of the basilica, and above that, a more recent church from the 12th century. St. Peter's Basilica is really just the newest addition here, built over so much older history. Number 9. The death of Pope John Paul I. In September 1978, Pope John Paul I died suddenly and without warning. His death came just 33 days after he was elected to the station of the Holy See. What was unusual at the time was that contradictory reports came out regarding the circumstances of his unexpected demise. Apparently, there had been anomalies with the death certificate, and to this day nobody is entirely sure what happened to one of the shortest-lived popes in the Church's history. What we do have are a lot of conspiracy theories, any of which could be the actual truth. The only problem is that we don't have enough evidence to say which one is correct. There is a theory regarding the Vatican Bank, and that those in charge of that particular wing of the Vatican were wildly corrupt and worried that Pope John Paul I was going to bring the hammer down. They allegedly murdered him to keep their finances safe. The corruption is real and documented. We know that the head of the Vatican's Institute for Works of Religion, one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world, was up to his neck in corruption. His name was Bishop Paul Marcinkus, and he was indicted in 1982 for being an accessory to the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano and losing roughly $3.5 billion. We also know that one of the bishop's accomplices was a man named Roberto Calvi, who was a member of the illegal Italian Masonic Lodge. He was found dead in London in 1982 just weeks before his corruption went public. His death was ruled as self-inflicted, but there are plenty of conspiracy theories around that as well. The takeaway here is that, looking at the Pope's death from an outside angle, it really seems that the Pope was killed to protect the bank. But in the end, the scandal was just too big to hide. Number 8. The Vatican Obelisk. Located in the very center of St. Peter's Square in Vatican City is an ancient monument called the Vatican Obelisk. Most people wouldn't be able to tell you what it is, but pretty much everyone would recognize it if they saw a picture of the square. It's the massive pillar right in the very center of the plaza that looks like a giant Egyptian obelisk from thousands of years ago. This monument is thousands of years old, and it is actually Egyptian. The obelisk was stolen from the Egyptian city of Heliopolis during the brutal reign of one of the most infamous Roman emperors in history, Caligula. But the history behind the obelisk is even more sinister than that. After the Romans built a specially designed ship to transport the obelisk from Egypt to Rome, it was used for the execution of Christians. The pillar stood in the circus of Gaius and Nero during the time that St. Peter was crucified. Romans would bring Christians to the base of this very structure and then brutally execute them. After the circus was abandoned, Vatican Hill became a necropolis, and in the Middle Ages the obelisk was still standing in the same place with the blood of Christians splattered around its base. It was only in 1586 that the monument was finally moved from its original position and placed in the center of the piazza. Number 7. St. Peter's Bones. A decade ago, the Vatican put on display for the first time in history the box which they believed to contain the ancient bones of St. Peter the Apostle and the first Bishop of Rome. It was Pope Francis, doing the 266th Bishop of Rome. This was an extremely big deal at the time because prior to 2013, no pope in history had ever said definitively that the 8 pieces of bone hidden underneath St. Peter's Basilica were indeed those of St. Peter himself. The bones weren't even discovered until 1939, deep inside the grottos beneath the basilica, which is basically a 5-story labyrinth of 2,000 years of history. All these years later, there is still no definitive way to say if these bones ever belonged to the Apostle Peter. In 1968, Pope Paul VI simply said the connection was convincing, but couldn't give any actual evidence to back up the claim. And in 2013, the Vatican threw all discretion out the window and decided to just run with it. But honestly, we don't know whose bones they have in that old chest. Author Bruno Bartoloni, who wrote The Ears of the Vatican, said that no pope ever allowed any scientist to study the bones, probably because they don't want to know, and also because there are documents hidden in the Vatican that say there is a 1,000-year-old curse on the tomb of St. Peter. Anyone who opens it will suffer from the worst possible misfortune. Number 6. The Pope prisoners. For about 60 years, not a single pope left Vatican City. It was one of the weirdest times in the Vatican's history, which saw each pope become a prisoner of their own little kingdom. It had been a long time in the making, and it finally came into effect on May 13, 1871. The Italian law of guarantees was the Kingdom of Italy's attempt at solving their pope problem. They hated that the pope had so much influence and power over the people, and so the law was aimed at forcing the Holy See to be an ordinary subject of Italy and not a sovereign. They promised to treat the pope with similar honors that they would give to a king, but he was to be under strict Italian law. In response, 5 popes locked themselves inside the palace of the Vatican and didn't leave, starting with Pope Pius IX, who died in 1878. The pope was so furious that he excommunicated the King of Italy, basically sentencing him to a lifetime in hell. It ended with Pope Pius XI, who eventually worked out a new deal with Benito Mussolini in 1929. They decided that Vatican City would be its very own country, which it still is today.